All right, so today the plan is to talk about how to return a value from a function. So that's basically the last thing we need to really fully utilize functions in our code. First of all, let's just talk about this return command. So there's this return command, and basically what return does is it causes the function to end immediately. So, and we can you can replace a return anywhere you want in a function. So for instance, if you have a condition to where you might want the function to end early, so you'd have some if or else statements. And so if you have a condition where you might need it to end early, you can just put a return in and it'll end early. So an example of that, using the functions we've already been using, let's say we have a void function that divides, and let's say that, so let's just call it divide, and let's say that we have two doubles and we're planning on dividing them. So we have, let's just say, argument 1 and argument 2. So we don't want this to divide if argument 2 is a 0. And so what we can do is we can check and see if argument 2 is a 0. So we can say if, so this would be inside our function body. So if argument 2 is equal to, and then this is going to be 0.0 just because we have doubles. So we don't want it to divide by 0, so at this point we're going to say something to the user about can't divide by 0. And then we're just going to do a return here, and that'll cause this function to end early. So this function will end when it gets to that return. Otherwise, if that second argument isn't 0, then we can do the cout, and we can do this division. So this is still a void function, like this function isn't returning anything. So let's look at how we would return a value from this function. If, like, let's say we're doing this divide and we want to return what the quotient is. So the way that, so we've already seen this a little bit with the main function. So we've seen the int main, and the main function has an int in front of it because it's returning an integer. That's why we do the return 0 at the end of our code, because it needs to return a value or an integer. So if we want our function to return something, we just specify what we want it to return. So like if we wanted to return, say, this division, we would say int divide, and if this would probably actually be double. So it's going to return a double, divide, and then we have our arguments. So argument 1, double, argument 2, and then I'm not going to go through this whole if statement again, but we'd probably want to do that too, just to make sure it's not dividing by 0. But then we can declare a variable in here, and we could say something like, well, actually, first we could just return the whatever. We could just do return, and we could just divide these. So argument 1 divided by argument 2. And this function is receiving two values, whatever argument 1 and argument 2 are. It's going to divide those and then return the value. We could also do, like, we could have it display what that is, but we also want to return a value. So if you have a function that is like this function, since we've declared it as a double, it's going to be expecting a return something. So if we don't do the return in this function, you're going to get a compilation error. With the void function, you don't need a return because it's not expecting anything to be returned, but you can use the return in a void function if you want the function to end early. The other way you can do this is this is just inside the same function, like just pretend like I'm replacing this code here with what I'm writing now. So we could declare a variable and call this like our div, so for division, and then we can say div equals argument 1 divided by argument 2, and then we can say return div. So you can do it either way. So the function needs to return something. If you have a function that is a double or an integer or a string or a character, so basically it's expecting that something is going to be returned, you have to have a return. And so you can, with the return, like let's just look at this really generically. So return, and then you have some expression here for the return. So this expression can be a variable, a literal, so you could put it out like a number in here, just say return 6. Like that's what we see in the int main, the return 0. So this can be a variable, a literal, or a mathematical expression. But you just need some, like you need to return something if you have a function that's expecting something to be returned. And the other thing is, if like in this function that we were just looking at, we're doing this math with doubles, like we're dividing by doubles. If this function were expecting an integer to be returned, so let's say we had int divide and then all of our stuff, and then we say return div, this is going to automatically convert the double. So div is a double. This will automatically convert the double to an integer. So it's going to demote so for instance, if you have 4.8, it'll return 4. So it'll automatically, the functions will automatically change the value to what, or the data type to what it's expecting to be returned. So I want to talk specifically about returning a Boolean value. So I think that like this int, double, I think those are pretty straightforward. The one that can be a little bit more confusing is bool. So you can have a function that returns a Boolean value. And remember, a Boolean is just true or false. Like it's going to be a 1 or a 0. So we can do, let's say, bool, and then we can check and see. So the nice thing about the Boolean functions is you can check conditions. So these conditions that we've been putting in, the if statements or the loops, we can use a function to test our condition. So let's say bool is valid, and then let's just say this is a number that we're sending the function. And we want to do, so let's declare a variable called status, and then let's say if the number is between 1 to 100, then we're going to say this is true. If it's outside of that range, we're going to say it's false. So that's a condition we're checking pretty commonly with the if-else statements. Let's do if, and then let's say if number is greater than or equal to 1, and number is less than or equal to 100, we're going to say the status equals true. Else, the status equals false. And then we're just going to return the status. So this function is returning either a true or a false. And the really nice thing about this, we're going to look at how we would use this in our craps game. But the really cool thing about this is, let's say that we have our main function now. So this is our Boolean function, and then let's say that we have a main function, and we want to check and see, like let's say that we've asked the user for a number. So cin number, and we want to check and see if this number is valid. We can either put all of this inside an if statement and check and see, or we can just do if is valid. So basically we're going to call that function, send it the number, and then the function is going to return true if it falls within that range. It's going to return false otherwise. So then we would just have our C out here that this is valid. Else, if it returns false, then it's going to be C out, not valid. So this is kind of nice to to use the Boolean functions because you can check conditions, and it makes your code look a lot easier, simpler and easier to read, because this code that we have here in this int main, I think that's a lot easier to see, okay, is valid number, rather than looking at the condition that we have inside this if statement. So this if statement would be inside the function, and you would just have a comment above your function that specifies that this function checks to see if the number is between 1 to 100. It returns true if it is and false if it's not. So that makes it really easy for someone to look at that.